On behalf of the Newark Public Library, welcome to tonight's program commemorating the 20th anniversary of September 11th attacks. I'm Tom Ankner, Director of the Charles F. Cummings, New Jersey Information Center at the Newark Public Library. Tonight, we are featuring a talk by Neal Stoffers, author of the book An Eerie Silence, an oral history of Newark firefighters at the WTC. Neal is a retired Newark firefighter himself who has written several books about the department based on an oral history project begun in the early 1990s. He will talk about the oral history project and his book about the important work the city's firefighters did at the World Trade Center site after the terrorist attacks. We ask that everyone keep their cameras and microphones off while Neal is giving his presentation. If you have questions or comments, type them in the chat box. Neal will field as many as possible after his talk. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Neal Stoffers. Welcome, Neal. Thank you for agreeing to be here tonight.
Hey, thanks for the introduction, Tom. And
Okay,
thank everybody. I lost you. Okay. Thanks. There we go.
I was just opening that up. Now I'm going to put my mute again. Okay.
Okay, we'll start again. Thanks everybody for coming, for joining in. I'm going to begin with a brief explanation of the book's title, then a short introduction to the subculture of firefighting, so you can better understand what the guys were thinking back in those days, 20 years ago. The book's called An Eerie Silence because so many firefighters use the words eerily quiet, eerily silent, or just eerie to describe that day. And I felt it appropriate to let them name the book. Next slide, Tom. The book is based on an oral history of the Newark Fire Department. I've talked with 175 Newark firefighters, from firefighter to director, appointed between 1940 and 2016. I published 9 titles so far. I didn't intend to separate the World Trade Center out from the rest of the books. It was just going to be part of the book, of one of the books. But then it became such a large and complicated subject that I pulled it out and made it a separate book. It's told from the New Jersey point of view, and the challenges that were unique to the Newark Fire Department. Now, the fire service is a relatively small community. FEMA says there are a little over 1 million firefighters in the United States. 33% of them are career firefighters. That gives us about 330,000 career firefighters in the country, compared to 900,000 doctors. So we're not that large a group. 9% of those of the departments, fire departments, are career fire departments. 71% are all volunteer, and then the rest are kind of a mix between the two. But it's not as simple as that. It's a very porous community. There's firefighters in Newark who are also volunteer firefighters in their hometowns, and the town where they live. Newark being their hometown, and they moved out. One of the captains on 9/11, a Newark captain at 9/11, was the chief of a Bergen County Fire Department, volunteer fire department. Another retired battalion chief from Newark was involved with the fire department in his town in Central Jersey. So it's kind of an interconnected, interrelated, meaning there are a lot of brothers and sons and fathers and uncles and cousins that become Newark firemen and become firemen in other towns also. So firefighters know other firefighters in other towns. It's also an international brotherhood. So a firefighter from Newark can be visiting Taipei, Taiwan, and run across a fire scene, introduce himself to the firefighters there, and get an immediate invitation back to the firehouse. And the job is simply called the job. The downside of the brotherhood is that when a firefighter dies in the line of duty, it hurts. If it occurs in a foreign country, then you take a moment of silence, you say a silent prayer. If it happens in the neighboring community, then it hurts that much more. And if it happens in your fire department, it's like you lost a member of the family. Now, the World Trade Center in New Jersey. The World Trade Center was owned by the Port Authority, but a year or two beforehand, they did some sort of leasing switch with some billionaire real estate magnate, and It was actually technically owned by somebody else and leased by the Port Authority, but the Port Authority still ran the whole deal. It's just across the Hudson River from New Jersey. So it's closer to New Jersey than it is to say Brooklyn. One line of the Port Authority Trans-Hudson trains, or the PATH service, runs from Newark's Penn Station to the World Trade Center. It's called the World Trade Center train. It runs 9 miles, approximately 9 miles, takes about 22 minutes to get from Newark's Penn Station to the World Trade Center. So people in North Jersey know the World Trade Center well. They were obviously very visible from many vantage points around the northern part of the state, and of course from Newark. There were familiar buildings where some of our neighbors may have worked. Just part of the landscape, only noticed when pointing them out to visiting family or friends. Now, the Newark Fire Department, 2001, although dwarfed by the FDNY, and it's called the FDNY, not the NYFD, there was some political wrangling going on back in the 19th century, and they changed the name to the Fire Department of New York instead of the New York Fire Department. So it's the FDNY. The NFD is the second largest fire department in the Newark metro area. It's actually called the Newark Bridgeport metro area. That's what the census calls it, and it's all considered one metro area. Newark's the second largest department there. About 600 and some odd firefighters on September 11th on 4 tours, manning 30 companies. Many of the men were appointed in the 1970s and the 1980s, and I point this out because the fire department is supposed to be a paramilitary organization, and some of the things I'm going to describe are going to be like, why aren't they listening to orders type thing? And this is the explanation. A lot of those men appointed in the 70s and 80s, this is the period of time that a lot of firefighters call the war years. There was an extraordinary amount of fires in the inner cities of America, and Newark had more than your average amount. So these men are more interested in doing the job, or getting the job done, than in doing the job. Or to put it another way, they're not so much interested in doing the things the right or prescribed way as they are in doing the right thing. They're working 10-hour days and they're working 14-hour nights. September 11th, 2001. The third tours were leaving the first tour. There's the usual banter at the leave of tours at 8 o'clock. Actually, it's from 7 to 8. They don't want you leaving at 8 o'clock, because if you go out the door for a fire at 4 to 7, you're not getting back until 9 o'clock or something. And so they prefer the guys come in earlier, and that's what guys usually do. There's the usual banter around the table. They're talking about family matters. Did your daughter get her braces? Did your son make the football team? How's the wife's new job? And then they talk about what happened. Was there a fire last night? We had a job last night on such and such an address. You might want to go up and look at the building. The number 1 mask was damaged. It's being sent down to the shop, that sort of thing. By 8:30, the firehouse belongs to the third tour, and then plans for the day are being made. Equipment and trucks are checked. Drills and inspections are planned, and the housework begins. Firemen do housework. They mop, they sweep, they clean the toilets, every single day. So at the beginning of the day, it's a very clean place. The equipment and trucks are checked. We did that already, okay? And then at 8:47, at 8:47, all that comes to a stop, because in the background of all this is almost always the morning news being shown on the television, just background noise. At 8:47, it becomes more than background noise. Something's happened at the World Trade Center. The World Trade Center, to review it real quickly as to what it is, two twin towers, 110 stories. Each floor is about an acre. It's said to have 50,000 people who work in it. It had its own zip code, and it was a groundbreaking design. It was called tube construction, meaning the exterior walls are the walls that support the weight of the building, not the interior beams. It has lightweight truss steel construction with its center core. And since it was the Port Authority, they didn't have to pay attention to the fire codes of New York City. And so there's a limited number of stairwells. All of this provides an open space. As far as tenants are concerned, that's great. It's wide open, straight around for 1 acre. As firefighters are concerned, it's a disaster. There are no fire breaks. It's like going into a wildfire, a 1 acre wildfire when a fire gets started on one of those floors. When it was first put up, they didn't even have sprinkler systems. Then after a 3-alarm fire, they put sprinkler systems into the center, but they didn't have redundancy. They only had one feed for the sprinkler. So if that feed is broken, there's no sprinkler system. And after the collapse, and there was an investigation, they found that the fireproofing around the metal truss was defective, and that added to the problems that the firefighter faced that day. Next slide, please, Tom. Firefighters and the firehouse reactions. Any firefighter who saw those first pictures instantaneously knew the enormity of the problem faced by the New York Fire Department. Some companies watched the news. Some companies went out to the vantage points around the city. Others just climbed up onto the roof of the firehouse. The guys who had gone home from work or had gone to their part-time jobs from the first tour started calling the firehouse to see if there were any plans being made if something goes wrong in New York. On-duty firefighters knew they could do nothing until they were relieved at 6 o'clock that night. But everybody knew that it was an FDNY job. They couldn't go over there to do anything about it. If they did, they'd probably get arrested. At 9/21, they closed all the tunnels and the bridges, so there's no way to get across the river anyway. Collapse and transformation. The South Tower collapses at 9:50. In the minds of Newark firefighters, it now becomes a regional crisis. Everybody there knew how the FDNY organized themselves and knew that those towers came down on the command centers around it. One firefighter turned to another firefighter. They're standing on the roof of the Velsberg firehouse. They turned turned to the other firefighter and he said, "Do you know how many firefighters we just watched die?" But they think there must be voids. There must be a way for people to have survived. There's a rescue problem, and they start planning to go over. Around this time, Rudy Giuliani gets on the air and says, "We need help. We need firefighters." So the men began to converge on the firehouses. But the deputy chief began to call around firehouses and tell them, if you're on duty, you can't go to New York. In the past history of Newark, companies sometimes did that. They sometimes went out of town on their own, and then the mayor would get a thank you letter from the mayor of the adjoining town, and it was like, what's happened here? They weren't supposed to be there, and there would have to be some reports written. Now, the unique challenges faced by Newark firefighters, and I know of no other municipality that had to go through this. The city administration opposed Newark firefighters responding to the New York City. The law department's worried about workmen's compensation liability. The fire administration is worried about coverage for the city. If they hit New York, well, Newark is 9 miles away. They might want another target. They don't want to send companies out of Newark because, well, there were 2 fires during the day in Newark while this is going on. They want those covered, the city covered by those companies. And on top of that, they don't want people going over there getting injured and they're not being able to do the command and do the job in Newark. So they're opposing all of this. Calls are made from fire headquarters threatening disciplinary action against firefighters who go to New York City. These calls are ignored. Other problems that they face. How do you move large numbers of firefighters without the city cooperation? The bridges and tunnels are closed. How do you get around that? The ferries are no longer in service. You got to get across the Hudson River. How do you organize all these guys? There are hundreds of guys that want to go. How do you organize them without the city's cooperation? In the end, there's no city administration coordinated response for the hundreds of firefighters who go across the river. The initial response of Newark Fire personnel now. Most firefighters are responding on their own time. There's only 2 units of the fire department that actually go there officially. New York City needs a post-blast trained specialists, and that's where the arson squad comes into play. The men began to gather the firehouses around the city and began to plan a response in. The fire administration actually sends battalion chiefs around with a special notice that they have to read to each company. The battalion chief walked into one of the companies, read the notice saying that there'll be disciplinary action taken against any firefighter who goes to New York City. Then he takes his uniform shirt off. He puts it on a chair next to him, and he says, okay, guys, now this is what we're going to do when we get off tonight. And they begin to plan what they're going to do. As I said, these are guys who are part of the fire department during the war years, and they have their own set of rules. The rescue squad, 201. These are the guys that just got off. One of the guys was still in the firehouse when the planes hit. He sees the news and he begins to call his tour back. If something goes wrong, we're going to need help. They're going to need help over there. While he's calling, a photographer from the Star Ledger calls him, who's a friend of his, and asks what he's doing. Where is he? What he's doing? He says, I'm in the firehouse, which is like 3 blocks away from the photographer is. He says, what are you going to do? We're planning to go into New York. Can I go with you? Yeah, you can come. So they end up going over with a photographer from the Star Ledger, and we'll see later that there's a picture involved with that. The third tour is sent to UMDNJ to set up a decontamination tent. They assume that there are going to be casualties coming, and they're going to be spread throughout the metropolitan area. And UMDNJ is the trauma center for North Jersey, so they're anticipating casualties coming there, and they have to decontaminate the people before they let them into the hospital. There were no casualties. They came to the hospital. Nobody survived. After Tower 1 collapsed, they got their gear. The first tour got their gear, the rescue got their gear, threw it in the back of a pickup truck, and drove into the city. They got to the tunnels. They showed their ID. By now, Mayor Giuliani is asking for firefighters. They just let them straight through. They park and they walk down 6 blocks from the ground zero, and they walk down Engine 12 and Truck 5 on Irvine Turner Boulevard. One of the guys goes home and his son's in the driveway, and his son's upset. He said, what happened? He said, there's a plane hit the World Trade Center. So his father says, no problem. It was an accident. We'll go in and look and see what's going on. He walks in. He's thinking a Cessna hit the World Trade Center by accident. He looks at what the damage to the building. He says, that's not a Cessna. There's a problem here. And he goes back to the firehouse. He gets in the firehouse and he calls the operator, and he asks them to broadcast over the air any firefighters who want to be volunteers to go into New York. The operator refused to do that, and then calls fire headquarters and tells them about it. And this is how fire headquarters got involved. Fire headquarters reacts and sends out those notices, and these are obviously ignored. The men gather and they begin to organize. They purchase some supplies, some water, some food in case they're going to need it over there. They don't want to be a burden on the New York Fire Department, but they want to get over there, and they have to have some water, etc. In the end, they just throw it underneath a car because it was very impractical. But they're unsure how to get to New York City. They know the tunnels and the bridges are closed. They don't know the rescue squad went through. And then somebody thinks about Liberty State Park. They must be going from Liberty State Park across, because they know that Jersey City has a mutual aid agreement with New York City. So Jersey City has to get across the river somehow. So they think they're going to go to Liberty State Park. One of the guys is outside the firehouse. They see a police athletic league bus going by, and they wave him down. They go and talk to the driver. We want to get to Liberty State Park. Can you give us a lift? The driver knows what's going on. He's a cop. He calls his boss. The boss says, take them in. So they get onto this bus and they go into to head for Liberty State Park. On the way over, one of the guys has a friend who's a judge. So he gets on his cell and he calls the judge. The cell phones are not as ubiquitous as they were today, or they are today, but they did have some cell phones. He gets on the phone with a judge of his, a friend of his who's a judge, and he asks, are they going to put us on charges? And the judge laughs and said, nobody's putting anybody on charges today. So that gave them a little more ease. They got that off their mind. They get to Liberty State Park and they see a lineup of rigs and firefighters ready to go over to the city, waiting to be called. So one of the firemen walks up and asks what's going on. They said they're on standby. They're waiting to the stage, waiting to be called into the city. And he turns to him and he says, waiting to be called, waiting for the command center to call you. There is no command post. They're all gone. You're going to be waiting here all day. There's a New York Police Department boat at the dock. He grabs the battalion chief who's with him, and they start walking down to the dock. Now, these two guys I worked with when I was in the field, in the middle of the city on Springfield Avenue and 100th Street. They are the heart and soul of the warriors, firefighters. They walk down to the cops, and as they're walking down, the firefighter turns to the battalion chief and says, "You got to think up something quick to tell these people." They walk up to these guys, and the one guy says, "We're from Newark. We're the best in the state. You got to get us over there." And the cop looks at him and says, "Well, who are you?" And the battalion chief says, "We're the Newark Strike Team." The Newark Strike Team didn't exist until that moment, but it got them onto the boat. They were happy. Before shoving off, the cops turn to them and says, "There's a possible biohazard over there. We're not coming back. Get off now if you're not sure." Nobody got off the boat. So there are about 12 guys. They go over to the lower Manhattan on this police boat. Now, the arson squad responds. The chief of the arson squad is off duty, and he's bringing his mother-in-law and sister-in-law, or he's escorting them into UMDNJ. His mother-in-law is getting cancer treatment. He hears the news, he leaves them, and he goes to the emergency operating center. As he walks into the operating center, he was off duty, so he's got this funky Hawaiian shirt on and jeans. He walks into the emergency operating center, and everybody's in uniform. They're looking up and they're saying, "Who is this guy?" So he sits around and sits down. He tries to get a handle on what's going on. Then he goes down a couple of blocks from the emergency operating center, buys a uniform shirt, has him sew on a patch, and comes back. So at least he has a uniform shirt on as he's sitting there. As he gets back, the New York Police Department requests post-blast experts. So he puts together a crew of arson squad, and the prosecutor's office sends a detective over with them. And they head down 280 to the Holland Tunnel. They're escorted through the tunnel as soon as they find out who they are. They're escorted through the tunnel and into New York City. At the union, the firemen's union, the phone's ringing off the hook. There was supposed to be a charity golf outing that day, and that has to be canceled. The vice president calls the New York City operating center and talks to a Coast Guard petty officer. He's told to go to Liberty State Park, and they'll have somebody for them. Then they get another phone call, said, "Drop to Liberty State Park, go to the Bayonne Marine Terminal." So the union gets about 40 guys together, and they start heading toward Jersey City. They meet up with another group of guys that were put together by a battalion chief. So by the time they get to Jersey City, they've got 60, 70 guys. They meet up. They get to exit 14 on the Turnpike, which is the exit for going toward Jersey City, and they're stopped. The state police ask what's going on. They explain. They show their ID, and the police escort them. The state police escort them toward Jersey City. As they're getting off at the Bayonne exit, they're stopped by the Bayonne cops, and the Jersey City the state police explain the situation, out of the way, and then they escort them to the terminal. When they get to the terminal, they're met at the terminal, or they go down to a small Coast Guard station or post there. And they got some young Coast Guard guys there with their weapons out, and they're not letting anybody through. So they have to call this petty officer in New York. And they give the cell phone to one of the guards, who gives it to the officer in charge. The officer in charge walks back and says, "I don't know who you guys are, but there's a boat coming over to pick you up." In the meantime, the guys from Newark who had gone to Liberty State Park and were denied entry because the Jersey City Fire Department is not allowing into their staging. The Jersey City Police Department doesn't agree with that. So a Jersey City cop, commandeers a Jersey City bus, asks the people to get off, puts the Newark firemen onto the bus, and now that bus goes down to the Bayonne terminal also. So they're adding to the group. By the time the boat is coming over, there is a van of doctors and nurses who want to volunteer, and they are added to the group. So you got 100 and some odd people now going over to New York City on this merchant marine boat. They drop them off at Battery City, the Battery Yacht Club down by the World Trade Center. Another way Newark guys got there was the New Jersey State USAR team. That's the Urban Search and Rescue Team. It's based out of Lakehurst. There's some Newark men who are Newark firefighters who are members of it. It's a self-contained unit. They just basically come, they drop themselves somewhere. They've got everything they need there. They're not going to be a burden on any municipality that they're aiding. They were the first mutual aid that the fire department in New York called. They respond with trucks and equipment. They send a scout team up to get the lay of the land, and then they put their trucks together and they go up, and then they set up camp at Ground Zero, and they're there for 10 days straight. During the following days after 9/11 and 12, 13 up until like the weekend, small groups of men continue to go over, usually in companies, 2, 3 guys, 4 guys from engine 12 or engine 6 or engine 5, and they would go over. They drive through the tunnels. All you have to do is show your ID. The cops check out to make sure you don't have any bombs or anything in your car, and then you go to the Ground Zero, and then you either walk onto the pile or you go to the command center, however you go about it, and they work for the next week or so that way, showing their ID. On the 13th, the city finally gets around to sending an engine, a truck, and a battalion chief over. What happened was one of the battalion chiefs called the chief of the department and says, "We got to do something here." And the chief says, "I'll get back to you." And then he calls back. He says, "Yeah, go get a task force together and go over." So they go to cover a Staten Island firehouse because there was a 2-alarm fire in Brooklyn. And then from there, they go from the Staten Island firehouse, they go to Ground Zero. And the guys continue doing this until New York shuts it down when it becomes a recovery operation. The arson squad starts working at Ground Zero. They're looking for any evidence, bomb evidence, explosive evidence, parts for planes, and they're working for bodies. So they go from Ground Zero, and then later they go to the Fresh Kills landfill, and they work there. If you can change the slide now, Tom. This is the picture that appeared in the Star Ledger from that photographer. This is Rescue 1, right at you can see the the collapsed buildings behind them. This is just as they arrived on the scene. You can see they're not covered with dust yet. They're going to be a mess in a little bit. And then they walked in and started working. Okay, Tom, next slide. Arriving. They arrived to chaos. The command structure has been destroyed. They're walking through the scene through a deep covering of concrete dust, paper, and silence. They describe it as like a fresh snowfall. That muffled sound, you can't hear anything until they make the turn, getting around, and you get to see toward Ground Zero itself, and then you can see the men operating there. But before then, it's like you're in the middle of a snowstorm. The FDNY guys look shell-shocked. 3 or 4 blocks out, you're already beginning to climb through the debris. When you get down toward Ground Zero, the sky is blocked out by the dust. It's a clear blue sky day, but you can't see anything down at Ground Zero. They're walking past body parts covered in dust. When those towers came down, they ground everything up, including human beings. Words used to describe it: surreally quiet, silent, eerily quiet, silent, like a horror movie. Godzilla movies came up a lot. There are no office furniture. There's no computers. There's no phones. There's nothing. Everything has been ground up. They were like a grinder coming down. They come down in what's called a pancake collapse, which is the most deadly form of collapse there is, with very few voids that will occur in that. The guys who drove in parked like 6 blocks away and walked down. The guys who came across on the boat were dropped at the river. They walk up from the river. Actually, they step off the boat, and there's a man with a gator tractor that just happens to be coming by. He was a maintenance man, supposed to be picking up garbage with this gator tractor. They hop onto the gator tractor and they drive up toward Ground Zero with that, and then they walk in the last few the steps. On the scene, what do they see? Fire trucks and ambulances that are crushed. Some of the lights are still flashing. The pile of debris that are stories high, 3 or 4 stories high, a pile of debris. And the surrounding buildings that are severely damaged. The Deutsche Bank building is like cut in half with part of the World Trade Center, and it's burning. The hotel between the World Trade Centers is badly damaged. All the buildings surrounding it are badly damaged. World Trade Center 7 has been hit. And what they hear, firefighters have something called a PASS device, or a public alarm system. They hear hundreds of personal alarm systems. They hear hundreds of alarm systems going off. It haunts some of the firefighters. One of the guys says he couldn't go back another day because of that sound just haunting him. And just show how surreal the whole situation is. Days later, some of the firefighters are walking in the courtyard that was between the buildings, and they still had the music that they would play, like the elevator type music they would play in the courtyard. That's still playing over and over and over again, 2 or 3 days after the event. The post-blast investigation. The arson crew is taken to the emergency operating center down by the World Trade Center. They walk into a meeting of all bosses. You've got deputy chiefs, deputy fire chiefs, assistant fire chiefs. You've got police inspectors. You've got the heads of sanitation, the heads of public works. All these different the health department. They're all down there, and they're making a lot of noise. The fire chief is trying to the ranking chief there is trying to get a handle on this, and everybody's shouting over him. So there's a grizzly old police inspector there who shouts for everybody to shut up in a very colorful way. And then turns to the chief and says, "Okay, chief, what do you want?" Because this is a fire department operation. The incident commander is the fire chief, or the ranking chief, because the fire chief was killed when the Tower 2 came down. So the chief starts asking questions. He asked the health department, I think it was, and the head of the health department stands up and begins to give a whole litany about how the health department is ready to help, and they've got this, that, and the next thing. And this grizzled old inspector tells him to shut up, and he tells him, "Tell me what you can do, tell me what you have right now, tell me how you're going to get it to me, and how we can use it." And that calmed the meeting down, and it went from there. At the end of the meeting, the battalion chief from Newark walks up to this chief, this inspector, explains who they are, and he looks at him and he says, "I've got work for you." And from that point on, they're hooked up with the New York Police Department team, and they worked with that team throughout the entire time. Working. What are Newark firefighters doing on the scene? Well, they're helping FDNY personnel in any way they can. They're stretching lines, they're getting water. The Deutsche Bank building, as I mentioned, is still burning. The water mains going into the lower Manhattan have been cut, so there's no water. The Newark Fire Department sends fire boats down to lower Manhattan, and they have to stretch hose from the rigs up by the Deutsche Bank building down to the river to hook up to the fire boat so they can get water up to the rigs, and then they can get water into the building. They get that water. The Newark firefighters help get the water from the river to the fire engines outside, the pumpers outside the building, and then they stretch from the building because the standpipe connections outside the building have been destroyed. So they have to stretch line into the building and hook up to the standpipe pipes in the building. Something that we did in Newark often when we responded to the projects, because they destroyed the standpipe connections outside. We would have to stretch a line in and pump into the standpipe just to put the fires out in the projects. So we had experience with this. It was very easy for us. A New York fire, and then they start searching the buildings around. They search the hotels, they search the office buildings. They're looking for any victims who can't get out or are stranded or trapped. A New York firefighter walks up to the chief. Now, there's something that she's known to understand is that on the fire scene, firefighters and captains wear black helmets. chiefs wear white helmets. So the battalion chief on the scene, the Newark battalion chief on the scene, is wearing a white helmet. A New York firefighter walks up to him and says, "Chief, you got to understand, this is just recovery." So some of the New York firefighters already know that there's not really any chance of anybody surviving this collapse. The last person rescued was rescued 27 hours later. And there was a group of New York firefighters who were trapped in the stairwell B of the North Tower that they were rescued. There were no other rescues after the collapse. The unsung heroes, and more than one man said this, the unsung heroes of this whole operation are the ironworkers. They cleared the area away so that the fire department could get in and work on things. They cut the beams, they cut the I-beams that were laying around. They did an enormous amount of work. Without their skill and without their machinery, it would have been much more difficult for the fire department to get anything done. They're on the scene and they're searching voids. They're looking for life, signs of life. They're looking for remains. The Union group, the last group, ends up being staged, but we'll get to that in a second. Next slide, Plum, please. Oh, no, I'm sorry. No, wait, I'm sorry. Could you go back, Tom? Okay, there we go. Building 7. Building 7 is the demarcation line of the first day. It collapsed at 5:25. There's before the collapse and there is after the collapse. You can tell when people were there by their stories about Building 7 coming down. There are 2 Newark groups working when Building 7 collapses. There's the rescue group that was working. They are on the pile. When they arrived on the scene, one of the men walked up to a chief and who's having an argument with a emergency police. They're by a hole, and the police want to go down into the hole. And the New York chief is saying, "Look, you guys don't do this. We do this. I'm not letting you down there," because he doesn't want any more deaths. He turns around, he sees the Newark guys walk. He says, "Who are you?" They say, "We're Rescue 1 from Newark." He says, "Okay, there's supposed to be somebody down there. You got to get them out." Now the police begin to protest. They're not even from New York. Why are you letting them down? And he says, "Look, these are the most highly trained guys I have at the moment. They're going down. Get down in the hole, kid." And that's how they started their day. They were searching holes all around the pile. They get to the top of the pile, and that's where they're working right now. And this starts to come down. They hear somebody yell, "Run." And they're sitting there, they're on their hands and knees in this pile. They've got acres of jagged steel and I-beams, smoke, and dust all over. They say, "Run." Where am I going to run to? How am I going to run through 2 acres to get away from this? By the time this goes through the dust, by the time they think of this, the dust is coming on top of them. And the one guy turns to the other guy and says, "I don't think we're making it back home." But they get covered by the dust and they don't get hit with anything. The 12 engine group, the second group that came over on the boat. After searching the hotels and getting the water set up on the Deutsche Bank, they're coming out of the hotel. And then this comes down and this pile of dust and the shock wave is coming at them. One of the guys actually takes another guy and pushes him into a small alley that is perpendicular to this. And so they're not hit by the direct blast of it. Doesn't even remember doing it. But the guy who did it, the guy who he pushed, thanks him for it. And he said, he was just acting on instinct. They get covered in all of this dust. When the dust begins to settle, they go back to work. The Union group is just making it to the yacht club. They get covered with the dust before they've done anything. After that, they walk up, they find a chief, and they ask, "We're Newark, we've got all these guys here, we're set up, we're ready to go." And the guy says, "Thanks for the work, guys, but right now I can't put you anywhere." And the chief who's in charge of the group says, "Well, where's the command center?" And that the New York chief points to a pile of rubble and says, "That's where the command center is. They're all dead. We're trying to dig them out. Do me a favor, go over and stand by." So they go over to a staging area, And that's where they end up standing by, because they just don't have any control yet. And the chiefs don't want anyone else to get hurt. So operating at ground zero. At the beginning, it's chaos. As the day goes on, it begins to get better. The command structure is now put in place. Work areas are being assigned. Rehab areas are being established. 18 hours into the operation, Engine 10 and Truck 10, who are the firehouse directly across the street from the World Trade Center, they've been turned into a rehab operation, a rehab center. Guys are going over there. They have to get the dust washed out of their eyes. They've got people going all around the ground zero with water and with eye wash. You got to get this stuff out of your eyes, guys. You can't have this. You got to get it out. It's going to cause permanent damage. So they're getting their eyes washed out continually. They're going to the rehab center where they take a bit of a break and they take in some water before they go back out to work again. A tent is set up and it's divided into sections. One section is for the airplane parts. One section is for the body parts. One section is for the personal belongings. This is how the first day ends. Now getting back to Jersey after that, how do you get back? The guys who drove over drive back. The guys who came over on the boat, they got a bit of a problem because they can get back from New York on a boat to Liberty State Park, but they don't have a PLA bus waiting for them. But at Liberty State Park, they've got lines and lines of ambulances waiting to take the injured to hospitals around North Jersey. The ambulances have nobody to take. So they start going back and they hitch a ride with the ambulances who drop them back to the firehouse. Over the course of the next few days, there are different ways the guys get back. And I'm just throwing this in now so you have an idea of what's going on. One group goes to the following day is going to go back and they shut things down where they park the bus, so they can't get back to their bus. So they have to walk down to a pass station. They have no money on them. They came over in their turnout gear only. They have nothing with them. So they walk up to a couple of Port Authority cops and they say, look, guys, we want to get back to Newark. We have no money. Could you somehow get us onto the train? They say, come on, follow us. So they get them onto the train. As they walk toward the train, they see the train's full of people. And the one guy turns to the cop and he says, well, we can't get on there. Though there are all these people. We're so dirty. We're covered with all this soot, with all this dust. And the cop says, don't worry, they'll make room for you. He walks in, he says, clear away some seats for the firemen. Everybody gets up. The guys walk in, they sit down on the seats, and then everybody starts cheering and clapping for the work they've been doing. The most unusual way of getting back that I heard of all the guys I interviewed happened a couple of days into it. There was a group of guys from Irvine Turner Boulevard again, from 12 Engine, had been working, and they are trying to get back. They have to find a working phone so they can call somebody to come and pick them up. So they walk uptown a little bit. They're not really even sure where they are by the time they find it, but they find a bar open. They walk into the bar, and then they explain to the bartender, look, we're from Newark. We're trying to get back. We just need a phone somewhere so we can make a phone call. The bartender says, sit down, gives them all a beer. He calls a limousine service. The limo pulls up and they go back to Newark in a limo with their dirty, dusty uniforms. By this time, as guys are coming onto the World Trade Center site, they're getting off at the ferries or whatever, they're walking down. There are people lining the streets, cheering them as they're going in. Everything that you want in terms of tools, in terms of food, in terms of, they're getting gourmet meals served to them on the site, at ground zero. They have operations set up. I had a friend of mine who was a chiropractor, goes in and sets up at Trinity Church down by the World Trade Center. And he's adjusting the backs of all the firefighters and first responders who have been injured, just in the pew of the church. He does this because it's the right thing to do. And also because I grew up with him and because his brother's a fireman. He's part of the family. He spends days down at ground zero doing this. Okay, now can you change the slide, Tom? These are pictures that guys sent me of guys, just Newark guys at ground zero at one point or another. Down all the way at in the left-hand corner, you see a battalion chief. There are two chiefs there with the white helmets. That's the battalion chief that called the chief of the department, and they're the ones who went on the 13th. That they're part of that task force that went at ground zero. So you can see the mess that are around here, but this is a little later on. There's not many pictures being taken. This is before cell phones were ubiquitous. So nobody's got cameras taking pictures, and it's really hard to come up with pictures of guys working down there. But these are the few that I could get. Okay, Tom, next. Okay, the days that follow. 12 engine on Irvine Turner Boulevard. They go down the second day. Now this is the story of the bolt. Okay, they're down there the second day. They didn't think they would be able to do much of anything. They said New York they don't even really have anything set up yet. You know, there's not much that they can do anymore. And then somebody calls them up and says, you know, we got to get over here. They got things all set up. You got to get here. You got to help. So this group gets together and they meet a FDNY retired battalion chief, who also happens to be the father-in-law of one of the firemen. As I said, there's a lot of interconnection between fire departments. And at first they're told to stand by. So this retired FDNY battalion chief says, let me talk to them. He walks past the Newark guys, walks onto the pile, and walks up to the chief that says, stand by. The chief turns around and gives him a hug. And all of a sudden, there are all these New York firemen coming over, shaking his hand, hugging him, patting him on the back, because it's a retired battalion chief. He was their battalion chief in Brooklyn. He talked with them, and then he waves the Newark guys on. So they get up onto the pile, and they start working with the dog, a cadaver dog. The dog takes a hit. So they start digging, and they dig in through down into a hole, and they would start recovering a body. First, the New York guys come over and they ask, who's that? What's it like down there? Who is it? You have a shoe or something you can hand up. Now, the body has been dismembered, disemboweled is the way it was described, but they do have the guy's shoe. So they pass the shoe up, and the New York guys say, no, it's not one of our guys, because the New York guys insisted on recovering their own men. But this is just a civilian, not just a civilian, but this is a civilian. So they take a couple hours. Now it's stiflingly hot. It's in the 90s here. It's humid, and the bodies are beginning to deteriorate. So the stench is unbearable. It takes quite a bit to get this guy out. And when they start getting the body out, they find a bolt is lying on his chest. So they reach to get the bolt off his chest, and the battalion chief is looking down. He says, keep the bolt, build something around it. When they remove the body, the New York guys say, you guys did a good job. And the New York guys thought that was just extraordinary, because these guys took such a hit, and they went out of their way to compliment on the job they did. Realization now, the battalion chief who was with these guys the first day is on the scene again, and he's up at the top of the pile. He's stripped down. He's stripped down underneath his turnout gear. He has nothing but underwear on because it's so hot. He's trying to keep as cool as possible. So that's what guys are doing just to get by. They're required to show ID before they're allowed onto the pile. They get onto the pile, and he goes all the way to the top, and he discovers a void at the very top of the pile. So he starts making his way down into the void with a group of guys. They get down, they get all the way down, they get to the bottom floor. And they look around, they see the motors for the elevators. They're in the elevator room of the World Trade Center. They're 15 feet below the top of the pile. 110 stories is above them in 15 feet. And then he realized, we're in the basement. There's only 15 feet above us. With 110 stories, nobody survived this. And he begins to accept that. Searching. They're going around. They're finding voids. They're working with dogs. It takes hours of work. When they find a void, one of the groups found a void, and it depended on the void that you found, how stable the area is. It depends on that tells you what you're going to be going through when you go down into that void. Some of the voids are in very stable areas, and the guys just go down and they make comments like it wasn't like you see in the movies with everything falling down around them. In other voids, you're crawling in and you move the wrong thing and things start to collapse. So you have to be very careful. It takes hours of work just to open up a void to get down. The FEMA people have group on the scenes. They have sound people. One of the guys found the void. He goes down into the void, comes back, tells the battalion chief about it, a New York battalion chief about it, and they get a FEMA group to come down, or a FEMA guide. The FEMA guys were spread out all over, so you're not even getting FEMA teams. You're just getting FEMA people. And they go down. They crawl down into this void. He's a sound guy. He tells them that if somebody is scratching a piece of steel 200 feet away, I can hear them, but there has to be silence. He puts the sound gear down and then he calls for silence. The word goes up out of the hole that there should be silence, and the entire area shuts down. There's not a sound, and he's looking, he's listening. He wants to see if there's any sound of anything, but they came up with nothing. Now the rescue squad, they're trained more highly than the average firefighter. They're trained with acetylene torches. They're trained with rope. They're trained with all sorts of hazmat, etc. So they're going around. They're cutting through I-beams. They're going around. They're roping down into voids. They're in demand. Well, they come out from one of the voids. They sit down on the seat on the side, and they're resting. And then one of the guys looks at the pile and he sees something. He sees what's called diamond plate, which is the type of steel that are on rigs so that you don't slip when you fall off the rig, when you're on the rig, I should say. And he asks his captain, "What is that?" Looks like diamond plate. So they go down, they start scratching around, they start moving things. They see they found a rig. So they call out to the New York guys, "We found a truck down here. We found a rig." And the New York guys descend on it, and they start a couple of hours pulling everything off, trying to get to it. They find 10 truck, the truck that's directly across, that's housed directly across from the World Trade Center. They're hoping that somebody dove underneath the truck. Somebody dove into the cab. There's some fireman who's still alive, but they found no one. New York guys are searching the roofs in the area. One of the groups has construction workers with them. They're up on the roof and they start finding airplane parts. They start finding body parts. They find the leg of a woman. They know it's a woman because it has they have nail polish on their toes. They've got a construction worker with them, a young guy, and he's not having a good reaction to this leg. And so the captain who's there says, "Yo, bro, you don't have to be here. We're trained in this. We do this. We've got experience with this. You don't have to do this." And he turns to the captain and he says, "They were Americans. I have to do this." And he stayed with them. So there was a lot of little heroism going on down there that you really don't hear about. Another thing you really don't hear about is when it rained. It rained a couple of days later. And when it rained, it got slippery. You're on a pile of jagged steel with rebar poking up left and right. You slip, you fall, and you're getting hurt. You're holding onto the rebar just to get onto this pile. And when it's raining, it gets that much more dangerous. Now, I told you about the team that they sent over, the engine, the truck, and the battalion chief that they sent over on the third day, on the second day, on the 13th. They hook up with the Sacramento USAR team. There are teams from all over the country, all over the world. There are French teams, there are German teams. There's the team from Sacramento. There's a team from Ohio that the rescue squad hooked up with, or the Engine 10 hooked up with. They'll show up in a second. From Chicago, and the rescue squad, or the captain, the battalion chief, who was formerly a captain at the rescue squad. They hook up with the Sacramento USAR team, and they give the guys a break. They go down into the subway, and they start searching the subways below the World Trade Center. The subways are flooded, but the token booths have not been searched, and they're above the flood. So they start breaking into the token booth, seeing if there's anybody who's there, anybody who's trapped or collapsed or anything, but there's nothing. It's all empty. So then from there, they have to move up. They move up and they start searching up above it. The captain and the cardinal. Now, this is one of the more embarrassing, as the captain would say, more embarrassing incidents that occurred. This is Newark's Engine 10. Now, keep in mind, New York's Engine 10 is directly across the street from the World Trade Center. This is the captain from Newark, Engine 10. He's got, and on the helmets, the way the helmets are the firemen and the captains have the black helmets. The firemen have a black shield. The captains have a white shield. So you can immediately turn around and see what the rank of the person there. And then they've got the number. And if you're in an engine company, the number is going to be in black. And if you're in a truck company, the number is going to be in red. And then they'll have your badge number underneath that in a little rectangle. And if you're a captain, it's just going to give you the captain. It's not, they're not going to have anything really. It's going to give you, it says NFD is what it says. But all that's covered up. They can see the 10, but they can't see the numbers. They can't see the fire department. That's all a precursor to what's going to happen. So they come over the second day, and they this captain, who is also an alumni of Springfield and Hunterdon, and a very aggressive firefighter, just begins to walk up the pile. He walks past the people who are searching down at the bottom of the pile, just marches up to the top of the pile, and his crew marches up with him. So wondering what's he doing, we'll follow the captain. They approach somebody, and they get a hose line. And they spend the next few hours putting out spot fires all around the pile so the men can begin to work and dig down. They're approached by a FDNY retired firefighter. He says he's found a hole. So the captain goes with him and then goes down into the hole. It's very unstable. They're crawling down into there, and they come to a point where there's an I-beam that's blocking going down, but they can see that you can go down further, and it looks like there's a large void down below it. So the captain comes out of the hole. He approaches the battalion chief that's in charge of the sector and says, "We chief got this hole." The chief says, "What do you think about it?" And he said, "I think this has got legs." He said, "Okay, go down." And he gets a FEMA guy to go with him. So this captain and the FEMA go down into the hole. This is now this guy has a camera. He doesn't have a sound device. They go down into the hole. They can't get past the I-beam. They start pulling things, and the place the hole starts to collapse. The captain gets hit on the chest with rebarb coming in as they're pulling on it. So they back off of that. They're not going to get down into what turns out to be a garage. They drop the camera down into there. They have a look around. They don't see anything that shows there's obviously anybody hurt or anybody trapped down there. So they back out. So the captain walks up to the New York chief and says, "We're going to go take a break." And chief says, "You deserve it. You did a great job." They start walking down. And as they're walking down, he hears some guys talking. They said that somebody was rescued. They rescued somebody who was trapped. And this captain says, "I got tears in my eyes just hearing this. They found somebody. They got somebody out." So he's walking down a little further, and all of a sudden, he starts being approached by people. "How did you get out?" His guys are being approached. Let me get your coat off. How was it down there? How'd you get out? How'd you get out being trapped? And they said, "Well, we weren't trapped. We went down into a hole to search. We weren't trapped." But they've got a 10 on their helmet. And so they're being mistaken for New York's Engine 10. And now they think that they've been rescued after a day being underground. They're getting embarrassed now. The firefighters, the only way out of this is they point to the captain and say, "Talk to my captain," who at the beginning is laughing at the firefighters. Now the news media is descending on the captain, and the captain is starting to get angry. He's so embarrassed, and he's being chased around by some guy who's got a camera. He's dodging and chasing. He ends up with the Ohio USAR team hanging out there for a moment, trying to get away from the press, because they keep asking him things that he has no answer to. "I was not rescued." After the press go away, he's got this one guy with the camera. He finds out later is taking pictures and selling them to the news media. he gets away from everybody except this one guy. And then he goes down to a group of chiefs and fire chiefs and police chiefs or police officers. And he's explaining the situation to them. And a clergyman walks up behind him. And he says, what a great job you did. I'm so happy you got out, da, 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 da. And he just says, yeah, okay. And that's it. And so this clergyman just kind of chuckles and walks away. Then one of his guys approaches him. And he says, do you know what you just did? He said, what do you mean? What did I just do? You know who that was? He says, no, who was that? He said, look, in the Catholic Church, there's God, there's the Pope, and then there's this guy. It was Cardinal Egan. And he says, oh, was it? You think I should go apologize to him? Yeah, I think you should go apologize to him. So he goes and he tracks down Cardinal Egan and he apologizes to him and he has a long talk with him and explains the situation. And the Cardinal and he get a chuckle out of it. They say the Cardinal is just a regular guy you could sit down and have a beer with. And as he's leaving, he pats the Cardinal on the back of his jacket and he walks away and he turns around and he sees his handprint with all the dust on the back of the Cardinal's jacket. He's on all this has been on the national news the whole time. And so now he's got a lot of explaining to do when he gets back to Newark. But he was very embarrassed by the whole deal and doesn't want to talk about it. Now, the next group, the New Jersey USAR team, they show up by the end of at ground zero by the end of day one. They set up their camp and they immediately go to the top of the pile and they start to drill down. Now, this team is made up of different specialists. The Newark guys are in the rescue specialty team. Then there's an EMS specialty team. There's a hazmat specialty team. There's even a canine specialty team. They're well organized. They're well drilled. They know exactly what they're doing. They go up to the top of the tower and they drill down. They drill straight down into the tower and they find the engine. They cut the engine, and when I say they cut the engine in half, I mean they cut the engine in half with all the tools they have, trying to locate fallen firefighters, but they can find nobody. They find bodies, they find airplane parts, but they don't find any survivors. They work 10-hour shifts. They have mandatory breaks, so they have to take a break all the time. It's a well-oiled machine. But most of the people are working on the pile, filling buckets. They've got these little 10-gallon buckets, and they're filling them. Very, very tedious work. They have to find, they're looking for airplane parts. They're looking for body parts. They're looking for anything that is beyond rubble. They put them into these buckets, and then the buckets are sent down to that tent that I told you about earlier. And then they're divided up, airplane parts in one place, body parts in another part, and personal items in another part. Guys are recovering ID cards. And at first they're thinking this is tedious and this is a waste of time. But then they realize as they're finding that all they're finding is a finger or a shoe. There's nothing else. They're finding that ID card may be the only thing left for the person's family to have for closure. And so they see that this is really worthwhile work and they don't feel so bad about it after that, after realizing that. By the end of the week, they move from rescue to recovery. They go into recovery mode. Within a week, they determine they're not finding anybody else. After that 27 hours, they don't find anybody else alive, and they don't even find whole bodies. So the fire department wants to recover their own. So they thank the Newark guys for coming, but we're going to handle this on their own now. And anybody who comes over now is just put to the side and staged. Entry is restricted. And when they're staged, they're really not assigned. Okay, Tom, next slide. So remembering, the fire department, as I said, its own little community with its own little traditions. Funerals are a whole separate tradition. There's a traditional funeral for a line of duty death. It's called the fire chief's funeral. It involves a rig that's usually the caisson unit. There are pipe bands and pipe and drum bands there. Firemen line up on the street outside the funeral home of the church. Uh, there are orders that are called out, company hand salute, and everybody raises their salutes. There's honor guards. There's a whole way of doing it. But the system is now overwhelmed. They've got 343 men that deserve a fire chief's funeral. They have 2 caisson units in New York City. So they need help. The Newark Fire Administration is reluctant, as I told you before, they're reluctant to send rigs outside the city. They want the rigs to fight fires in Newark. But the firefighters, again, guys who were part of the war years, do an end run. They go to a councilwoman. She sets up a meeting with the mayor. They go to the mayor's office in dress uniform, and they explain to the mayor that New York needs help. We'd like to be able to help them. We'll get the guys. We just need a rig. The mayor calls the fire chief, the fire director, I should say. The fire director explains that, we don't like sending the rigs out. The mayor just says, I want this to happen. So it's going to happen. So now Newark sends over Engine 17. Engine 17 is a brand new rig, and they start taking part in the funerals over in New York City. At one of these funerals, one of the guys from that went to see the mayor sees an antique fire truck go by as a caisson unit. And he says, that would be a great idea. We should have that in Newark. So he gets back, he goes on, and he starts researching. He finds a guy who had written a book about what are called thermodyne Macs. These are the Mac rigs that the city had in the 60s. When I came on the job, we were still using these rigs as spares. And so I drove some of these rigs. I rode on the back step because you rode on the back step at that time. But there are none in Newark. So he calls the police department of the town where this guy lives. And he asks them this guy's name, this guy's phone number. And the police department says, well, what do you want this for? Who are you? So he explains the situation. The police gives him the guy's phone number. He calls this guy. The guy says, how'd you get my phone number? He says, it doesn't matter. This is what I want to do. And the guy says, okay, I'll tell you right now, there's nothing out of Newark. Everything in Newark is gone because Newark uses their rigs for the Macs, and then they junk them. But there is a rig that's on eBay right now being bid on. And I know the guys who are bidding on it. I'll tell them to back off. You make the bid. So he goes on to eBay. They're asking for the guys who are bidding, I should say, have backed off, and the guy who's running the auction finds out who's now bidding, and it's just a Newark guy. He calls him up, and he's screaming over the phone, "Who are you to get involved with this?" And he's going on, and he says, "Look," and he begins to explain the situation. The guy listens. You want to put this together for a caisson unit to work at the funerals in New York? Yeah. He said, 15 grand, the rig is yours. Okay. So now now this guy doesn't got 15 grand. He gets guys together, then the firemen go to the Newark Firemen's Federal Credit Union. They get a loan for $15,000, and they send it to Kentucky, which is where the rig is. The rig was used at the Lucent plant in Kentucky, and now they're liquidating the plant. The rig has 5,000 miles on it. They get one of the fire captains, the Newark fire captain, who owns a trucking company. They have him drive down with a flatbed truck. They load the rig onto the truck. They bring it back to Newark, and they start to retrofit it. Now you have to understand that that firemen in general have part-time jobs. They can be anything from a welder to a carpenter to a stockbroker. So they get the guys together, and they get the welders together, they get the sheet metal men together, and they retrofit this rig with a lift, so they can lift coffins onto it, get it onto the rig, and they can be part of they can be a caisson unit. Then they get the rig lettered for Newark, and they get a magnet. And they also have a magnetic sign that they can put on the side of the rig that says FDNY. And they go over to New York, and they do multiple New York funerals. The bolt that was on the body that they recovered is on the dashboard of this rig. We'll show you a picture of it in a second. An FDNY battalion chief whose son was killed in the line of duty on 9/11 sees this rig and wants the rig at his son's funeral. The funeral, so they go to Brooklyn and they to pick up the casket, and they go from Brooklyn, they go to St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan, which is where the funeral is out of, and it's off of this Newark rig. Then another firefighter's funeral is out of the Bronx, and he sees the rig from Newark, and he wants it. It was the last funeral of that era at that time. Now there've been funerals since then because they recovered remains, but the last funeral of that period, the initial period. And there's an argument because New York now has caisson units available, but this father wants his son to have it, and it just so happens that the fire director in New York was a firefighter out of the Bronx firehouse where this man had worked out of, and he makes sure that the Newark rig is the one that is the caisson unit for that. The reactions of the men. Newark firefighters were at ground zero. Many won't talk about this with anybody but firefighters. Usually other firefighters who were there, they talk about it with me because they know me. They use a technique that firefighters use, and firefighters say this one way or another, but it can be a job that gives you memories that you don't want access to all the time. So they compartmentalize those memories. And we say we put them into a box, and we put the box in the back of our mind, and it's sealed. And then you can occasionally open the box, take the memory out, view it, and then you put it back in the box. Some guys are very good at this, and some guys aren't, and they have more of a problem. Reactions of guys immediately after. One of the guys came home and crawled into bed and lied in bed for a day just to process everything he'd seen. Another guy, it took 3 days to process what he had seen. One of the other guys got home and went to meet some of his friends in a bar. And he's sitting at the bar and he just breaks down and begins to cry. Long-term memories, long-term effects. We'll get into the medical stuff later, but long-term memories are there. One of the guys I know, he was the battalion chief who dug down to the bottom of the pile into the elevator room. He's going to be doing a presentation for his brother who was in North Carolina. And his brother asked him to do it. And so he's starting to put together a presentation. And all of a sudden he's having nightmares again because these memories are coming back. There was a commemorative ceremony in Newark given months afterwards. A lot of the Newark guys, but the mayor had called. And a lot of the Newark guys refused to go to the commemoration ceremony because of the city's attitude at the time. They actually had to go to the firehouses and order men who had been at ground zero to go to the commemoration ceremony to have people there. But Von Essen, the New York fire director, came to the commemoration ceremony to thank the Newark firefighters for the work that he knew they did. A lot of the guys haven't been to ground zero again. Some have been to ground zero, but they're not ready to go to the museum. Some won't watch the documentaries. Some because they say it's an exploitation of what happened at ground zero and people are making money off of it. Others because they just can't deal with it. They still, it would be 15 years when I discussed it with them. After 15 years, they can't deal with it. After 20, I'm sure they still can't deal with it. Firefighters, as a rule, usually don't do the old PTSD debriefing. They debrief around the kitchen table in the firehouse. It's not good for us, but that's the way we usually do it. The Tunnel to Tower Run that occurs each year. The Stephen Stiller Run. Stephen Stiller was a firefighter stationed in Brooklyn who watched his firehouse and found there was no way to get across to the World Trade Center. So he put his turnout gear on and then he jogged from Brooklyn to the World Trade Center where he died. And every year they have a charity Tunnel to Tower. There's a Tunnel to Tower Foundation now. They have a run. Newark firefighters have a relationship with these people because they've done a lot of fundraising for them. And so when they have the run, the Newark firefighters actually begin the run. And then, of course, Newark firefighters do charity events. One guy his sons were in a soccer league, and so he asked the soccer league if you do a charity fundraiser for the Tunnel to Tower Foundation, and he did this fundraiser, raised like $15,000 in one day, and then donated to the widows and children of the firefighters. But there's a price to be paid. We talked a little about the emotional and the mental price that you pay for it. But there's another price. One of the captains of the rescue squad, who went over multiple times, died a few years later of lung cancer. Another firefighter who I had known for most of my life, and it was a member of 10 Engine when they went over, had a hard time dealing with it. He was a guy who as his, one of his engine mates put it, carried his heart on his sleeve. Had a hard time dealing with everything that he had seen. So they gave him medication to deal with that, and he eventually ended up overdosing on that medication. And the real tragedy of it was his brother was a chiropractor who went over there. He was a lifetime friend, and he just recently died of cancer, it's lung cancer. But he had no way of registering for the 9/11 the 9/11 fund or anything like that, because he was just a chiropractor. He didn't have any official proof that he was on the scene. Nobody took a picture of a chiropractor adjusting backs. So when he was diagnosed, he couldn't tap into the fund, couldn't have them cover his medical records, his medical expenses. But he went over and he really didn't care. He didn't mind because he said that he did the right thing in going over. And that's what happened. There's so many little stories like that around. People are still dying today from what happened at the World Trade Center. There are cancers among the firefighters. One of the guys that was on the USAR team ended up with thyroid cancer. He described the hell that he went through for 2 years of treatment to finally get the cancer under control. Another guy who went a few days later ended up with throat cancer. The battalion chief that I showed you that was part of the response team from the city itself ended up with leukemia. Unfortunately, that's probably just the beginning. I don't want to be pessimistic, but I'm trying to be realistic here. There may be other guys coming down with stuff. It's just difficult to say. But with all of that, none regret having gone. Okay, Tom, can you change the slides? This is the bolt that's on the caisson unit. Next slide, Tom. And this is the caisson unit. As I said, it had 5,000 miles on it when they got it, and now they treat it like a little baby. Next slide, Tom. This is the pictures of the guys on the Tunnel to Tower run. As you can see, a lot of them are young. This is what the young guys do. The slide all the way down at the bottom in the the right-hand corner, that's guys who are finishing up the run. Next slide, Tom. So none knew the conditions that they were responding to when they went. They only knew that they only knew the need. That's really a definition of most emergency responders. But on 9/11, they knew something of what they were getting into, and they knew that it was really, really bad. But they still went because they knew the need. They knew their brother firefighters were down. They knew the people were trapped, and they went over there to try to help. And so that's it. That's the end. Any questions?
Oh, all right, Neil, that was great. Thank you very much. Let's see if there are, I don't see any questions in the box. I actually had a question though. There have been a number of commemorations over the past week to mark the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Do you know if the Newark Fire Department did anything to mark the anniversary?
No, I don't really know. I'm off the job 17 years, so I'm kind of
Yeah, I know. I thought you might have heard though or something. No,
no. I did 3/4 of the fire department. I don't know anymore. It
okay.
used to be I knew everybody because I trained them, but now I don't know any. It's only the really old timers there.
Oh, okay, okay. So the oral history project has been used as the basis for a number of books, you've done. Can you talk a little bit about how that started, how the project started?
Okay. I attended this gets a little complicated. After I earned my master's degree, my master's thesis was the history of the Chinese in New Jersey. And I had intended on continuing with it because it was just actually it was the history of the first Chinese community in New Jersey was the master's thesis, and I wanted to continue that. I thought I would have to do interviews, and at the time I belonged to the Chinatown History Project. I contributed to them. You did $20 or something to be a member, and they had a seminar that they were going to give on oral history that they were trying to do to preserve the history of New York's Chinatown. For $20, I got a course that was given by by a professor for Columbia University that cost several $1,000s to the Columbia University students. I was told, don't tell anybody you're doing this, but I guess that was 30 years ago, so I can say something now. And one of the first things he said is that you, in order to do a good oral history, you have to have good storytellers. Now, I don't know how many people have been around the firehouse kitchen table, but firemen can tell some stories. Some of them are factual, some of them embellished, but they can tell stories. So it crossed my mind that now I really have to do this. And it really felt necessary because at the time there was they just commemorated a few years before they had commemorated at the civil disturbances of 1967. And when they had done that, they had never mentioned the Newark Firefighters when they do those commemorations. And I thought that nobody's really said anything about the Newark Fire Department, and these guys are now dying. There's nobody on the job from 1967 at that point, by 1991, and these guys are dying. And I thought that it would be a shame if their stories died with them. So I started interviewing people. The first person I interviewed was they came on the job in 1949. And then I went back all the way to 1940 by the time it was done. So it was done to preserve the history of the fire department. And by doing that, I actually accidentally preserved the history of other things.
Yeah.
So I've got a book out now about the city itself, and that's from a firefighter's point of view, but it's about Newark itself, remembering Newark.
Okay.
So that's how it started.
Okay. Well, that's great, Neil. Thank you very much. And thank you for sharing all this great information you had. You had some really terrific stories there. We have ordered the book for the library. So I'm, hopefully you'll get some people reading it from there. Maybe some other people can also buy the book as well. And thank you for doing this tonight. This was terrific. You're going to be doing another program for us in early November. Isn't that right?
Right. That's going to be on the Remembrance of Newark book. That's going to be on what I just mentioned with the accidental book review. I
think it was the 3rd or the 4th. I forget which day, but it's on the calendar. But I think I think it was the 4th. I thought
it was like the 18th or something like that.
Oh, no, I think it's the 1st. I'll check and I'll get back to you.
November 18th. My wife's telling me it's November 18th. So
okay. All right. I'll look at the calendar then. Yeah. But it will be in November.
No, it's November 3rd. You're right. It's November 3rd.
Oh, it is November 3rd.
It is November 3rd.
Okay, good. Okay. Well, thank you again for a fascinating talk. And thank you to everyone in our audience for turning out tonight. Good night, everyone.
Okay.
Be safe.
Okay.